Hi, my name is Rose Capdevila, and I'm going to be talking to you about the practice and ethics of conducting research online. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to be offered this opportunity to talk to you, albeit, unfortunately, not face to face, like so much of what we are doing these days. But that's exactly what I want to talk to you about in relation to research. So, the organizers asked me to tell you a bit about me, which is always a bit awkward, but here we go. I grew up in Canada and did my first degree at the University of Toronto, where I studied political theory and psychology. Then I went to the University of Barcelona to do a diploma in Hispanic studies. You may have worked out from my name that my family comes from Catalonia. I then went to the UK to do a PhD at the University of Reading, supervised by Rex Staten Rogers, and then, when Rex unexpectedly passed away, by Professor Erica Berman. This background provided a mix of perspectives which I really appreciated. I now work as a senior lecturer in the School of Psychology and Counselling at the Open University in the UK. I also have had the honour since 2014 to co-edit the journal Feminism and Psychology with Professor Katrina MacLeod from Rhodes University in South Africa and Professor Jean Marichek from Swarthmore College in the United States. This year, I have also become chair of the Psychology of Women and Equality section of the British Psychological Society, an organization that I've been an active member of since I was a PhD student. My research focus is around the discursive construction of boundaries, primarily around gender and methodology, but also politics. I'm an international collaborator in the SeGReVUni project that this talk is a part of. I also do research around selfies and how young women use these to curate their identity, particularly in relation to the affordances of different social media platforms. The third and related area of research I do as part of the Networking Families Research Group. We are currently working on 3 projects: supporting children and adolescent mental health through familial online relationships, supporting care experienced young people to develop and promote their mental well-being, and sharing digital parenting, primarily around mothers and how they are position themselves in relation to social media, which is a very gendered practice. I will talk a bit more about this research to illustrate some of my points today. And the final slide about me is to acknowledge my colleagues. I'm a collaborative researcher, as are many feminist academics, and these 4 people are the ones I work with most closely on the projects I will mention here. But of course, there are many others I could name in different contexts. Okay, no more about me now. This session will explore the practice and ethics of conducting research online, as I said. Is it just a pale substitute for real-life, face-to-face work? There are a lot of issues around online research. Some of those we all know from the more traditional forms of data collection, but also others that are specific to the online environment. In this talk, I will touch on methodological and theoretical issues around this approach, but I'll focus primarily on the ethics, because I believe all feminist research should be conscientiously and explicitly ethical by design. So, I've started with this introduction and overview, and now I'll talk about researching online, drawing on my own research. I will talk through 3 examples. First, I will go through some examples of collecting data using Qualtrics. However, it is worth noting that Qualtrics is just one of many similar software options. There are many others, like SurveyMonkey, etc. I'll then discuss online interviewing and how benefits and limitations of this technique, along with the ethical issues they bring to the fore. Finally, I'll talk about some research we've conducted on public data from social media platforms. This form of data collection is different from the other 2, and that it's not based on moving traditional face-to-face methods online, but rather a new form of data collection. I'll then go on to discuss the ethics of online research methods and address some of the new horizons and dilemmas that these platforms offer. Finally, I invite you to consider any questions, comments, or suggestions you may have in relation to this presentation. Okay, to start, I would like you to consider the definition of Internet-mediated research, or IMR as it's often referred to. For my purposes, I've drawn on the guidance provided by the British Psychological Society in its 2017 document, Ethics Guidelines for internet-mediated research, developed by a team of UK psychologists led by my colleague Claire Hewson. This document defines IMR as any research involving the remote acquisition of data from or about human participants using the internet and its associated technologies. As with traditional approaches, internet-mediated projects may adopt a variety of research designs. Their focus may be on obtaining quantifiable measurements, such as surveys or many types of experiments, or on obtaining rich, meaningful, elaborate narratives, as is often desired in qualitative approaches. So I'll be discussing examples from across this spectrum. As I mentioned, there are lots of software options for online data collection, but I will use Qualtrics as an example because of its popularity for academic work, given its focus on data protection. Qualtrics is a means of taking face-to-face research online, including traditional experiments and surveys, and more qualitative approaches that have gained popularity in the last few years. Story completion. Finally, I will look at a quali-quantological approach discussed by Stenner and State and Rogers in 2004, known as Q methodology. So, what are the benefits of this research? Well, the first is accessibility. Anyone with access to the internet is a potential participant. Also, the investment in time and money is minimal. You can do these things quite cheaply once you have the software and quite straightforwardly, and the effort is not very large. They offer anonymity. Some data collection can be collected completely anonymously, as there's no face-to-face contact and no personal data is recorded. Another issue is one around confidentiality. As I mentioned, many of these systems are designed with data protection in mind, so personal data need not be available to the researcher. And the security of data. Consistency of experience is an important issue. It makes it easier to provide a consistent interface with the study, though the context, of course, will vary, unlike in traditional lab experiments. Excellent support from Qualtrics is really important, or equivalent softwares have the same. Most of these platforms pride themselves on their customer service, and certainly I've been impressed by Qualtrics. But with the benefits, of course, come limitations. It's very inflexible in terms of design. Because most of us aren't computer programmers, the interfaces are based on flowchart type options. How many choices, what size of text box, etc. It can be difficult and expensive to deviate from the available options. So there's also a real loss of contextual information. You have no idea of the conditions in which your participant is engaging with your study. Are they completely focused, or are they trying to cook dinner at the same time? And as you would expect, the completion rates are much lower. Anonymity, of course, cuts both ways. While some may participate because of anonymity, they don't want you to know who they are, and that makes it possible for them to participate. It also makes it easier to walk away. They won't know if you don't actually do the research. And accessibility, I mentioned that at the beginning of the benefits as something that makes it easy for people to participate. But you can't really talk about internet-mediated research without being attentive to the digital divide. Not everyone has internet access, and not all of those who do have access to anything more than just a smartphone. Okay, so here's an experiment that we run on one of our modules at the Open University. It's a standard experiment on change blindness, and you will have seen them before. It flickers back and forth different images of the same thing when the participant has to click when they see a difference. It measures response and reaction time. It's robust, straightforward, and relies heavily on the assumption that weird participants are representative of the population as a whole. If you've not come across that term before, weird refers to Western educated from industrialized, rich, and so-called democratic countries, making up the word weird, which, in psychology has a problematic history, so to speak, of trying to generalize from that kind of population to the world at large. However, what this does do, it can collect an inordinate amount of data quickly. Also, as you can see from the image, it can be completed on virtually any device, including a smartphone. So I won't say too much about this, but the situation is similar with the survey. It's clean, anonymous, organizes the data in measures neatly for the researcher to take away, and you can introduce some qualitative options with which again are collected and sorted for you by the program. So similarly, story completion takes the qualitative element of the survey and allows you to collect richer data, even quite extensive and nuanced language with no need to transcribe. If you're not familiar with story completion, what you do with a participant is you give them a story stem, so the beginning of a narrative, and then participants are invited to continue that narrative in any way they would like. Now, what this does is it collects this data and you can take it directly into qualitative analysis programs like NVivo or Atlas TI. It's obviously slightly less user-friendly on a telephone, but definitely manageable. The third kind of method I want to talk about is one that we've been developing with some colleagues, and it's about using Q methodology. Now, Q methodology is a means of studying shared and subjective understandings of an issue or phenomena across a group of individuals. In a Q methodological study, participants are asked to sort statements or items about the topic under investigation into a quasi-normal grid. So it's seen as quali-pontological in the sense that it looks at text, but it also uses statistics. The analysis is both statistical. It uses factor analysis, so they're factor analyzed by person to look for shared understandings. But then the analysis of the created factors is done discursively, so to speak, or thematically. I'm more than happy to be contacted about this methodology if you're interested, and I've provided details in the reference list for Watson Stenner's book on this topic, Doing Q Methodological Research, Theory, Method, and Interpretation, as well as a short chapter from 2019 in SAGE Research Method Foundations by Paul Stenner and myself. So what we've done is we've been able to adapt Q for use in Qualtrics with some help. This is an example in which the system was not as flexible as we needed it to be, but it did provide access to a group of participants that we might not otherwise have been able to reach. If you are interested in Q, we hired a research associate to write a user manual for conducting Q methodological research using Qualtrics. Please do get in touch, and I'd be happy to send you a copy if that's something you think you might want to pursue. So, Qualtrics for data collection. And this is the area that I want to focus on most, and that's the ethical considerations. And basically, Qualtrics doesn't really push the boundaries of standard ethical practice in terms of transparency, withdrawal, debriefing, confidentiality, data management. These are all things that are written into standard research practice, and Qualtrics has adapted them and designed them into its own systems. The two issues for me with Qualtrics are around accessibility. Yeah. And again, we draw on the digital divide, hard to reach populations. It facilitates some of them, but actually makes it very difficult for others. And the other issue is one of ecological validity. We really don't know what's going on at the other end of the internet connection, so to speak. And that can be useful or it can be problematic, but it's certainly something we absolutely need to be aware of when doing this kind of research. Okay, so the next area I want to talk to you about is doing online interviews, which have become all the rage during COVID. I mean, it's become the only way of doing data collection if you're doing interviews. Our university in mid-March decided that we were no longer being given clearance to do face-to-face research of any kind. So doing research online in this way was the only possibility we have, and we were in the middle of a project. We're about to start data collection, so we took it all online. Now the benefits are the flexibility, yeah? So you can do it anytime, pretty much from anywhere with anyone who has, again, a data connection and device, so it's flexible. The other benefit is that it records. You can record it automatically, and so it takes the images, it can take just the audio, and it can transcribe for you. Not brilliantly, not perfectly, but actually it can save you a lot of time if your focus isn't just on the transcription, but you're actually analyzing the video. It has limitations around security, obviously. you know who it is that you're seeing, but that's the case with all interviews. The same one, I bring it back and back. Accessibility is always an issue in research. And the other one is about establishing rapport. And I think, you know, as a society, we're learning more about this. I think early on it was very difficult to establish rapport in online kind of discussions, but we're all getting better at this. It's not the same as face to face. You're not having a cup of coffee or whatever, or, looking around the same environment. There are different kinds of interruptions. So it is more difficult, but basically it's an issue of just paying more attention to at the beginning of the process to establish that rapport, or having a pre-call just to set it up. So there are lots of ways we can address that, but that is certainly one of the limitations of that form of data. So what are the new possibilities with online interviews? Well, it's the software. We've got Skype, Skype for Business, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, FaceTime, and I think it's really important to attend to the affordances and limitations of each. They do slightly different things. And one of the things that the universities have become very obsessed with is, which ones protect data or are more secure. And that is obviously a very, very important issue. But also, as I said, accessibility is an issue, and some are easier to use than others. Some facilitate certain kinds of recording, some facilitate subtitling. So Microsoft Teams and Zoom or I think Skype for Business, sorry, will allow you to add subtitles. Now, if you're interviewing someone who is hard of hearing or the sound isn't excellent, that's certainly a benefit and something you want to consider. Also, what screens you can share, what you can do with it otherwise is also very, very helpful. So online interviews are great because you can do individuals or groups, or you can do even groups of people who are in different places. So you don't have that added complexity of bringing everyone together in one physical space, because they can do it from their own home or from their own space. You can create, for example, in Zoom breakout rooms where your participants can go to different places to do different things. You can do, as I said, audio, visual. I do a lot of work with photo elicitation and processual methods, which are looking at the details of how people are working through specific activities, mostly around social media in my case. And also, you can embed activities in online interviews, as you can do face-to-face, but actually sometimes even more easily, because you can pair it all at the same time, it records it, and so that can be really, really helpful as well. So just to explain a little bit how it works, to give you an example, I'll talk a little bit about our research around digital mothering. So what we did is, a few years ago, we collected data from mothers about how they used social media to talk about their parenting, to present their parenting, to talk about their families. And what we asked them to do is to choose some images that they posted online and bring them to the interview. And these were conducted face-to-face, and we could discuss those with them. And we would encourage participants to tell their own story. And if you're familiar with visual methods, then you'll know that these photos serve to elicit affect, they elicit memory, and they're very useful in the context of talking about the people's everyday, day-to-day practice. What we did, again, in March to June of this year, is we did similar kinds of interviews, same questions, again, the focus on visual methods, again, the choice, but we focused it around COVID and the experiences mothers were having and how they were using social media to support their parenting during the COVID-19 lockdown. So I won't talk too much about the way affect was used in the original study, but I do want to talk a bit about our findings around digital mothering during COVID-19 and the way the whole process has intensified mothering, the whole issue of homeschooling. And we know from the research that homeschooling was majoritarily being carried out by mothers and not fathers. There's a lovely video, if you want to look it up, on YouTube, of an Israeli mother saying, if I don't die of corona, I will die of homeschooling, because it was such a test of parenting. And mothers trying very, very hard to produce these good citizen identities because they were relationally embedded within communities, and the additional pressure that came out of the pandemic to do that kind of mothering was very difficult. What we got a lot in our interviews again is around the tears behind the display. And it was interesting because while we were interviewing mothers in their own home, and their children were running up and the family life was happening, they were much more in the space that they were talking about. And we feel that facilitated actually the rapport and made talking about those things much more natural. And they talked a lot in both the studies about the use of photos as doing emotion work and bridging social distance and gaps, especially during COVID-19, when things like, for example, there was lockdown during Mother's Day and people were able to honor their families, their mothers, their children within that context using social media. So social media became an opportunity to do that. So we found that process actually a very successful one, but there are obvious issues with online interviews, and the ethical considerations I'd like to focus on a bit is the security of online spaces. Some of you will have heard, I think everybody's heard, early during lockdown, when people started having Zoom meetings and not locking their rooms, they'd suddenly have a flurry of pornography flying through their meeting, which can be very disturbing, or people just dropping in. I accidentally dropped into a friend's meeting with her family because we were having a meeting later and I was testing the line, and I tested the line and there she was having a chat with her family, which is deeply embarrassing. But if you're using it for research that needs to be a confidential space, then that kind of security becomes very, very important, and having that expertise and that knowledge becomes important. There's the obvious technical issues that we all know about. If something can go wrong, it will go wrong, and you have to be ready to deal with it. So that's one of the issues that we need to deal with. And the way that impacts your participants is something you need to attend to as well. Anonymity, obviously, if you're talking to someone on screen and it's being recorded visually, not just audio, then they become much more recognizable. Same with confidentiality. Data management, you have some very, very rich data there that needs to be stored correctly and taken proper care of. And people's time and the data they offer you, obviously treated with respect and carefully. And I think what we really want to think of is what this format facilitates and what it impedes in terms of access. As I said, you do need to have a smartphone, a computer, a space, some help. So some people are in a better position to participate in this kind of research than others, and some researchers are in a better position to participate in this research than others. And that's something that obviously plays into how we understand our research and how we would like to understand our research. The last form of kind of data collection and research that I want to talk about is one that we found very, very fruitful. And that's around social media and what is considered publicly available data. Now, this is something that we simply did not have access to before the internet and social media. You could collect information particular kinds of ways, but this kind of public data where people speak Twitter, you can get entire conversations at Twitter, debates, and collect all that data in effectively 5 seconds, data that would have taken you months to collect in the past becomes easily accessible. And that is one of the benefits. It's easy to access. The data is plentiful. You don't have to transcribe. It's all transcribed for you and allows you to analyze things both qualitatively and quantitatively. It is a bit of a researcher's paradise in that sense. It's all there for you. There are limitations, and obviously it's often quite thin data. Let's face it, Twitter, it's a tweet. It's 140 characters. I know you can create one after another, but the depth of analysis is often not there. And you have, trolling, which it becomes its own problem, and people who are purposely disruptive in a way that you don't get in traditional research in quite the same way. The other thing is that when you collect that kind of data, you are absolutely subject to the social networking platforms algorithms, And I think there's more and more research out there, well, something that's not a huge surprise, that algorithms are biased, that algorithms exaggerate existing bias, and who's writing, those programs will write their own biases into that program. And if you are interested in this topic, I'd really recommend you look up the Algorithmic Justice League, which is an organization of researchers, computer researchers, scientists at MIT and other institutions, but started at MIT, looking at the way bias is written to algorithms. So you want to look at if what those could be. So for instance, with our Networking Families group, we have an account for the Networking Families group to collect data. So it's not any of our personal accounts, and it does in fact bring up things differently. So that's something really important to attend to, that bias that algorithms are already creating, and how you might get around those, or how you might conceptualize those within your research. And another limitation is simply too much data, so much data that it becomes very, very difficult to manage in any qualitative, meaningful way, So for quantitative analysts, it's fantastic. The more data, the better. The more, you can do deep dives and all kinds of things with it. But for qualitative researchers, we want to be attending to how we work with that data. How do we attend to it? And that we're being respectful always of people's data. So here's an example of some research that we did in our group around Mother's Day. So what we wanted to see is the way that mothering was constructed online, and we chose Mother's Day, which in the UK is in March, but in most other countries is in May. And we've collected data 3 years running now, 2018, 2019, 2020. We focused on data sources by we just used Twitter and Instagram in that case, and because they were open, and we only used publicly available posts. We did hashtag Mothering Sunday, which is what Mother's Day is referred to in the UK. Also hashtag Mother's Day, and then hashtag Mother's Day of the Year, and hashtag Happy Mother's Day. So we collect them, as I said, so 6 batches of data collection, and we have about 200 posts and all the comments. So if a word count for about 50,000, we tried to be careful about what we were collecting. So what will we be able to find through this kind of analysis? Well, many things. I'll just give you a brief little introduction here. So we had this snapshot of Mother's Day's post illustrated how mothering and gender is enacted. We thought through social media, brought it to the fore. And the Mother's Day posts, really interestingly, all focused on, or mostly focused on gratitude. So children being thankful and grateful to my mother's wonderful, my mother's done everything for me. I wouldn't have succeeded in what I've succeeded if it weren't for my mother. However, the comments that people made on them were all focused on beauty and similarity. They were very, very focused on kind of genetic determinism, like, oh, you look so much like your mother. Oh, your mother looks so much like you. Oh, you could be sisters. Oh, how beautiful, how beautiful. Beautiful was the most prominent word across all of the posts, across 6 data collection points. And what was very interesting as well was the normative constructions of gender and how they were mediated through these kinds of familial relationships. So how gender played out through the mother, the daughter, the son, the daughter, the husband, the production of grandparenting as well. So we were looking for, through mother's presentation of self, the children's presentation of mothers, and young women's presentations of self. And through this, we analyzed the construction of femininity. And this was data we think we couldn't have collected any other way. We couldn't have accessed kind of public understandings and public discourse at this level without it. However, over the 3 years that we've been collecting this data, we've seen some huge important changes in how ethics were approached. Yeah. So what is publicly available data? Yeah. When we started the research, anything that anybody had posted um, on Twitter or Instagram to open accounts was considered fair game. The ethics committee didn't even question it and kind of said, why are you asking us for ethics? There are no individuals, there are no people involved here. The second year, they were a little bit more cautious. And by the third year, there was a serious concern about how we were using this data and what was going to happen to it, which we shared. So there are some references that I've included in the list of references about this, about what are the expectations of users, of Twitter users and Instagram users when they post something. Yes, it's public, and of course they understand it's public, but do they understand what the use is? And there's been research on, would they be happy to have it used in research? To have their comments used in research. And generally speaking, they're not bothered by it. A lot of this, as you can imagine, has come through, scandals like Cambridge Analytica, where Facebook has been using, people's personal information, publicly available information even, to target them in particular kinds of ways around advertising and political propaganda. So you can see what that is. There's also a kind of more nuanced understanding of who is the participant. It seemed like in early years, there was some assumption that there was no participant, that the discourse somehow existed disconnected from the bodies that produced it. And that's something that we need to think about more carefully. And important questions like who owns the data? Yeah. Is legally, the data is actually owned by the social media platform. However, we would not expect the person who produced it to not have some control over it. And I know that Feminism and Psychology, where I'm a co-author, we're very careful about publishing work that uses social media data, publicly available social media data, especially images. And we do ask authors always to have permission from not only the person who has posted the image, but anybody who is represented in the image. Yeah. And the other thing to think about is, do different platforms require different approaches? We know from research that different platforms are doing different kinds of things. Young people don't go to Facebook anymore unless they're trying to talk to their grandmother, and YouTube has now become all the rage. TikTok has become all the rage, and lots of things are going on in TikTok. Lots of community building, interesting community building. During COVID-19, we saw a lot of familiar relationships, what we refer to as family TikToks. So lots of different things are going on there. And again, always in research, we're thinking about confidentiality, anonymity. What does this mean for the person whose data is being used? And finally, the data management issue, which is always a consideration. How are you storing it? Are you respecting your participants' words, your participants' contribution to your research? So just to say something about kind of the new horizons and the dilemmas and the ethics of online research methods, a method that I haven't spoken about, which one of my PhD students, Anna Colum, is using WhatsApp focus groups, creating focus groups online with WhatsApp, creating both synchronous and asynchronous focus groups that can be accessed in all kinds of different contexts, which she's found very, very useful for her research around citizenship in Kenya. So that's another kind of method that's available to us now that wouldn't have been in the past. And when we think about the ethics of these things, I think that there are questions that we want to ask ourselves. There are concepts we want to talk about. Most of them I've raised now, but things like judgment calls, Fransk et al. Discuss the idea that what we need here is guidelines, not recipes, not this is right, this is wrong, but what is it we're doing? What is it we're doing? What is our intention? What is the situation? What is contextual? And that, as you would in any qualitative, ethical qualitative research. But it also offers us this new kind of new time, new space, new senses of privacy, new identity boundaries. What becomes your identity? Is it just, the body that you are and the way you present it, but clearly your identity, your online identity, is part of yourself and projected in particular kinds of ways in time and space. And we want to be thinking about that and what it says about the self and what it says about who we are and the way we engage with the world more broadly. Also, really what we want to have is a sensitivity to context and participant expectations. Doesn't matter if a participant will never know that you've quoted them or showed an image of them in in a conference presentation or in a paper. Doesn't matter whether they know or not. And I think it doesn't. I think we want to behave ethically. All of the images that you've seen that I've showed of any participants have been recreated by people that we know. So none of them are the actual real participants. And we do that all the time. We recreate images and we shovel text to make sure that participants aren't identifiable if they don't choose to be. Sometimes we do get permission to show them, and that's fine. But we need to make sure that there is informed consent there. And this is what we're going. So these relational engagements, this kind of informed consent beyond the individual. When someone gives you consent to access their accounts, they're not just giving you access to their own lives, they're giving you access to other people's lives as well. And how does that informed consent go beyond that individual? With our interviews with mothers, obviously, they weren't just talking about themselves, they were talking about their partners, they were talking about their children, they were talking about their family, they were talking about the other mothers. And that all built into it, and how do we protect those people? And are they part of our participant group in a sense? So again, this brings us back to this kind of publicly available data. What do we do and what is publicly available? Is publicly available anything that I can access without a gatekeeper? Or is publicly available something that we need to negotiate with our participants and think about within the context of our research? And also, I just want to mention the work by Barbosa and in Milan around how to anonymize this kind of work. Obviously, if you quote something from Twitter, someone just has to put it into Google and they can find it in 30 seconds. So we need to think about how do we do that, especially as discourse analysts. We need to think about what are we doing when we're translating people's words, and how does that impact on what we're trying to say, and how does that impact on how we're working with our data. And there, I don't think at least we don't have answers to this yet. I think it's something we're thinking through, and I think that's what is, obviously you need this kind of attitude of exploration, this attitude of intrigue, of wanting to know, but also considering what the implications are at each point. So I think those are the main issues that we've been working with, trying to get a handle on in terms of internet-mediated research. So to summarize a bit, the kind of things we've been talking about, the New Horizons, is looking at the process approach. So thinking about how things work through. And what I kind of focus on in this sense is around being reflective, around being recursive, going back to things, and being dialogical. So you're working with others in this process. It's always relational. I mean, research is always relational, but those are the three areas where I think we need to work on and develop if we want to do internet-mediated research ethically. And around reflexivity, and this is not new, around our personal reflexivity, disciplinary reflexivity, and around the political reflexivity. What are we accomplishing when we are publishing or doing research in a particular kind of way, and to consider what jobs we're doing that we may or may not have considered in our design. So that brings me to the end of this talk. Thank you so much for your attention. I know it's trying to listen to these talks that have been pre-recorded and they're not interactional in the way that maybe we would like. But I just want to thank you for listening, and I welcome questions, comments, suggestions. Please feel free to email me. There's my email address and also the link to my webpage. and I would welcome any of those things. I hope you found something of interest in my talk, something you might want to pick up, and yes. And thank you to the organizers again for inviting me along, and I look forward to any feedback on this presentation. Thank you very, very much.